This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. The deadly attack on the World Central Kitchen convoy comes as the Biden administration continues to send massive amounts of arms to Israel. Reuters is reporting the Biden administration is considering a new $18 billion arms package for Israel that would include dozens of F-15 fighter jets. This is in addition to the recent U.S. approval of 1,800 2,000-pound bombs and 500 500-pound bombs, as well as 25 F-35 fighter jets. We're joined now by Josh Paul, a veteran State Department official who worked on arms deals and resigned in protest of a push to increase arms sales to Israel amidst its siege on Gaza. He's the former director of Congressional and Public Affairs for the Bureau of Political Military Affairs in the State Department, where he worked for 11 years. Now a non-resident fellow at DAWN, that's Democracy for the Arab World Now. Josh, thanks so much for joining us again. I mean, in light of what we are talking about right now, the World Central Kitchen suspending its operations in Gaza after their 6 workers and their Palestinian driver were hit by airstrikes, Israeli airstrikes. Can you talk about these latest news? First, the Washington Post exposed the sale of the F-35 fighter jets and other bombs, and now Reuters talking about additional weapon sales to Israel. What this means, how they're used by Israel.
Thank you for having me. And perhaps I'll start with that latter point, because I think, this is important context. The strike on the World Central Kitchen comes on the same day that Israel wrapped up its operations in Al-Shifa hospital that has left the ground littered with decaying body parts, and nor is it by any means the first strike on humanitarian aid workers. In February, Israel murdered U.S. citizen Musa Shawa, logistics coordinator for the charity Anera. In November, it murdered 3 doctors from Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. And in December, it murdered Reem Abu Lebdeh, who was a board member of MSF UK. And of course, in February, after having given direct permission for an ambulance to retrieve 6-year-old Hind Rajab from the car where she sat with the bodies of her dead parents, Israel struck that ambulance, killing the medics who were on their way to save her. So, this is a continuing pattern. And in that context, as you note, last week, the US authorized the transfer of over 2,000 more bombs to Israel. This week, I anticipate it will authorize the transfer of 1,000 more. It has been doing this on a weekly basis since the conflict began, just an open tap of arms. And these are the arms that Israel is using to kill not only thousands of civilians, but hundreds of aid workers as well.
And Josh Paul, this use of U.S. weapons in this way by Israel, we're talking about not only the killing of aid workers, but the attack on consular offices this week in Syria, of the diplomatic offices of Iran, and the banning of Al Jazeera. What does U.S. law say about how weapons can be used by states that receive them from the United States, and when it comes to violations of human rights?
Well, that's a very good question. And there are a variety of laws that should, in theory, apply here, ranging from the requirement that US-provided arms be used in accordance with international law, to more specific laws that, for example, US assistance cannot be provided to a country that is restricting the delivery of US-funded humanitarian assistance. We have seen many examples of Israel restricting, if not striking, the delivery of humanitarian assistance. So I think these laws all need to be called into question. And the important thing here is that that's not what is happening. In fact, the Biden administration has on purpose not been seeking legal opinions on whether the arms we are providing to Israel are being used in accordance with the law. It has also not been seeking assessments from the intelligence community of Israel's actions using US weapons. It is essentially sticking its fingers in its ears and, covering its eyes and saying, we don't know what's going on. It is making a purposeful decision to not know what is going on. And I have never seen anything like it in my time in government.
Is it even possible when you're dealing with 2,000-pound bombs to talk about protecting civilian life as Israel continues to do?
Not in the context of a place like Gaza. This is an area, the size of Metro Cleveland, basically. and it has dropped thousands of these bombs in that space. It is impossible in that circumstance to talk about, the principles of discrimination and proportionality that are central to the laws of armed conflict and international humanitarian law.
On Monday, journalists questioned U.S. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller about the latest U.S. arms transfer to Israel.
I understand the fulfillment can take years, but are you basically saying that the authorization of the transfer coming in these recent weeks was a coincidence?
I'm not saying it's a coincidence. Israel has been engaged in a military conflict, and of course, when you are engaged in a military conflict, you deplete your military stocks.
So there was a request in recent weeks for the additional fulfillment of these particular weapons.
I'm not going to get, as is always the case, I'm not getting into the timings of exact requests from here. I'll be quick. But this is a process that we keep Congress fully apprised of, our relevant committees. But when you see these types of requests and when they get publicly reported, you have to remember that Israel is in an armed conflict and is expending a great deal of defense material, and some of that needs to be replenished for Israel's long-term security.
Right. And my final thing on this is, Secretary and a lot of senior officials from this administration basically said far too many Palestinians have been killed. But when you go and and we know that the administration's policy hasn't changed. It is not conditioning weapons to Israel. But when you go and make such an authorization of the transfer in recent weeks, even if the actual weapons transfer has been approved years ago, don't you think that is going to damage the weight of your word, your credibility, and basically your sincerity in saying that far too many Palestinians have been killed?
I do not agree with that at all. We have been very clear that we want to see Israel do everything it can to minimize civilian casualties. We have made clear that they need to do that they need to operate at all times in full compliance with international humanitarian law. At the same time, we are committed to Israel's right to self-defense.
Just to follow up, a 2,000-pound bomb is self-defense, in your opinion?
So they need to have the ability to defend themselves against a very well-armed adversary. Like I said, Iran, Hezbollah, which has thousands and thousands of fighters and quite sophisticated material and quite sophisticated weaponry, as we've seen them deploy, against Israel in the last few days. So yes, they do need the modern military equipment to defend themselves against those adversaries.
In Gaza before, in the beginning in Gaza.
And we have made clear to them that whatever weapon they use in Gaza, be it a bomb, be it a tank round, be it anything, that we expect them to use those weapons in full compliance with international humanitarian law. And we have had very frank conversations with them about the fact that far too many civilians have died through their operations, and that they need to do better in taking into account the need to minimize civilian harm, and we'll continue to do that.
And this is State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller just last week.
We have not found them to be in violation of international humanitarian law, either when it comes to the conduct of the war or when it comes to the provision of humanitarian assistance.
I assume, Josh Paul, that you know Matthew Miller well. You worked at the State Department for 11 years. Your response?
So I think there's a lot to unpack there. Just going back to his last point, again, the point here is that they have not found Israel to not be in compliance with international law because they have not asked their own lawyers whether that is the case or not. So for as long as they do not ask the question, they do not get the answer that they do not want. He also noted, and the reporter who was interviewing him noted, that this was a case formally approved by Congress. This was for the F-35s. This was a case for F-35s approved by Congress in 2008. That was before the first Cast led the first significant Israel-Hamas exchange of fire in 2009. And it comes now in the context of an immediate and ongoing conflict. So the idea that you can take an authorization that Congress gave in a peacetime context, a completely different context, and say that this gives us the approval to move forward with these arms transfers now in this new context is very questionable. And of course, as was also noted, Israel is continuing to use these bombs, regardless of what Matt said, that it may be able to use them against Hezbollah or against Iran. It is using them in Gaza. And by continuing to provide these arms at the rate that we are doing so, what we are essentially doing is letting Israel choose wherever it wishes to use them, rather than forcing it to make the hard choice of what is actually the threat for which it needs these weapons.